Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell. You'll get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And when I'm not asking Bruce, hey, how big was Batista's? Well, you know. One of the things I like to do is help people save money. And if you're watching this video right now and you're in a 30-year loan, man, you're overpaying your single biggest bill and you may not even realize it. I want you to do a little experiment for me. Take your calculator out, multiply your monthly house payment by 360 payments. That's how many payments there are on a 30-year loan. That big scary number, that's your total of payments. You're looking at that number? You know you can do better. Keep more of your own money right now and go to savewithconrad.com. Or maybe you've got credit card debt. Man, it's not a matter of if I can save you money with that. Your average interest rate on a credit card is more than 20%. And by the way, all the interest you pay on those credit cards, it's not tax deductible. Whereas the mortgage interest, well, that is tax deductible. So if you owe this debt, it's up to you how to pay it back. Doesn't it make sense to get the cheapest rate possible and the greatest tax deduction possible? Find out how much money you can save right now for free at savewithconrad.com. You don't need perfect credit. Even scores in the 500s can be approved, and it's no cost out of pocket. But maybe best of all, we're licensed in more than 40 states. We can help more families than ever before. But how much can we save you? Find out right now for free with a quick quote from savewithconrad.com.
Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to ARN. And of course, we couldn't do it without the founder of the Four Horsemen, the creator of the Spinebuster AA, the enforcer, the Hall of Famer himself, Arn Anderson. Arn, how are you, man?
Well, just like you, I'm doing better with all this vaccinations and stuff starting to work. That's a good thing. Got both of my vaccinations, did not have one episode of anything. No headaches, no nothing. It was perfect. Felt great. And a lot of people are following suit. And it seems like this summer may actually end up shaking out like a real summer.
Wow. How about that?
Wouldn't that be nice?
That would be nice. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm looking forward to, if you haven't already, you need to make plans. Tomorrow night, as we're talking, is Double or Nothing. And your man, Cody Rhodes, has quite the challenge in front of him. You nervous, anxious, excited?
Not really anxious, excited always. I'm always really thrilled, I guess is the best word, to see when a challenge gets put in front of a young talent. And I would look at this, other than this being a huge challenge for Cody, which it is, I'm looking at Gogo having a huge challenge in front of him. And here's a guy that, man, he was a incredible boxer at one time. He's an incredible athlete, obviously. He's picking up our business, in gangbusters. He's learning every time he goes to the ring. So it's going to be a big challenge for him, and it's just going to be good TV. I can't wait to see how it shakes out stylistically.
It's going to be fun. If you haven't already, make plans to join Arn on pay-per-view tomorrow night. And of course, Dynamite will be back to their regularly scheduled Wednesday, this coming Wednesday. And it's every single Wednesday on, of course, TNT. So check it out. But today, we're not talking about current wrestling. We're talking about 1983. We've sort of hit the reset button on all things Arn, and we hope you're telling your friends about it. May has been an exciting month. We talked about growing up Arn in episode 1, and then Pensacola with Pee Wee in episode 2. Last week was pounding the pavement for Watts, and today it's finishing up with the Cowboy, and we're going to talk about 1983. Let's start from the very beginning. Your first match of the year that I can find is against Bruno Sammartino Jr. at the Riverside Centralplex in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Man, Bruno Sammartino Jr., that's not something we hear a lot of. What can you tell us about Bruno Jr.?
Well, that carries a hell of an aura around it, doesn't it?
It does.
God almighty. If I said I wasn't intimidated, I would be lying. Just from the fact that second generation wrestlers, I feel, get certain things just by osmosis, just by growing up around the business. As a kid, you hear things, you see things. You see your dad come home injured, and what does he do to put himself back together? And, the conversations that go on, I'm sure, at the dinner table, just all those things that are related to the business that carry over to your personal life. And I'm thinking, man, then, I got to look at the kid. And then I started asking a couple of guys, have you heard of him, Tim? And he was just getting started too. So experience level, he was still very, very green, but man, I guess he did some powerlifting too, because the kid was really, really super strong. I think he carried an aura and a chip on his shoulder, because I'm sure a lot of people said to him, "You're never going to be your dad." Well,
right.
That's tough. It's a tough cross to bear sometimes.
If you haven't before, go Google image David Sammartino. Of course, I called him Bruno Sammartino Jr. That's another name he went by, but most of us saw him on the WWF a couple of years later when he was going by the name David. But to your point, dude, he is jacked, like a crazy looking power lifter, dude. He started wrestling when he was only 20 years old in 1980. So here he's, I don't know, 2 or 3 years in. I think he's just a couple years younger than you, but as you said, the pressure that must be on him to sort of fill his dad's shoes had to be monumental, but he didn't let that bother him here. As with everything we talked about so far in 1982, you wind up in the losing effort, not winning a lot of matches so far. Are we, Arn?
Imagine that. It has started already. That common theme that would stick with me throughout 38 years, no wins. But you know what? I was learning something every single day. And, I was just trying to absorb every little bit of something different that would occur during a match, and the audience response to something that I did during a match or that he did during the match. And it's an ongoing process. That's one thing I could say about Bill Watts territory. When you have those rules in place, no punching, no kicking, no thumbing a guy in the eye, no fighting outside on the floor, you got to keep it in the ring and wrestle. You better learn how to work.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the stretch you're on here, because this is, I don't know, super fascinating to me. We start on January 4th against Bruno Sammartino. The next day, we're wrestling Dick Murdoch. 2 days after that, we're wrestling Dr. Death Steve Williams. I don't think anybody has ever wrestled those three guys in a row like that. Maybe but you. That's got to be some trivia for somebody. But Bruno Jr. and then Dick and then Dr. Death back to back to back. Yeah, that's tough.
Nobody did it and lived to talk about it. I'm sure, right? One little bit of history, and since we're going back and we're collecting some of the stuff that we might have skipped over the first go around with the podcast. A little bit of a trivia fact: Steve Williams and I started exactly the same time. He was just starting in the business at that time too, and Bill Watts was sky high on Doc, as he should have been. I mean, Doc was a beast. Football, when you wrestle in college, especially somewhere like Oklahoma, and you play football too, you're special. Mike Rotundo is one of those athletes. You're special. To excel in two sports in college, it's incredible. So Doc, was just, man, I mean, when he scooped you up, it made you feel like a little baby. And Dick Murdoch was as good, which I've said before, as he wanted to be that day. If he was in the mood to entertain, he was a hell of an entertainer. If he wanted to go out and play it straight, he was a hell of a wrestler and a tough guy. And that's a pretty good 3-day stretch. You're 100% correct on that.
So the next day, though, as we said, after the Bruno Jr. match, you're doing TV, and it's with Dick Murdoch here. That's a quick effort. 2 minutes, 46 seconds at the Irish McNeil Club in Shreveport, Louisiana. Dick Murdoch, Captain Redneck. We've talked about him a little bit before. Did you ever have any interesting drinking stories with him?
I never went out with Murdoch, but I heard all the stories, and he was one of those guys that whoever he was traveling with, he would be the passenger and he would be the bartender unless there was another guy in the back seat. But, it would be a case of beer a night. he was one of those guys that he would stop in, buy a case. And if it was a 200-mile trip, he would probably drink most of it. If it was a 300-mile trip, he would probably drink all of it. And telling the stories, he was just one of those guys that was so fun to be around, that once he got drinking and rolling and we're going down the road and you're developing that friendship and that camaraderie, and, it just, he was just fun to be around.
I've heard that Coors Light was the beer of his choice, to the point where he was some sort of like unofficial spokesperson. Bruce has almost joked that he had like a card he carried in his wallet where he didn't pay for Coors or some such nonsense.
Well, I'm sure he didn't pay for anything, anywhere, anytime.
I get it. It's a wrestling podcast, but he's saving us money on our mortgage. Do you really trust this process? The reviews don't lie. 5-star review after 5-star review. We make it fast, we make it easy, and it's no cost or obligation. Give us a shot to earn your business. I'm telling you, you'll be glad you did, especially if you like keeping more of your own money. You don't need perfect credit or money out of your pocket, so what are you waiting for? Hurry to savewithconrad.com.
I'm sure he didn't pay the traditional 4 cents a mile trans. I'm sure he didn't buy the beer, but you know what? I would probably say, let me retract that. I bet you Murdoch bought the beer for whoever was in the car, but he didn't pay no trans. He never picked up a dinner meal, anything of that. But where it was in his wheelhouse, if there was 4 guys in the car, I would bet you Murdoch would buy a couple of cases of beer and pop for that. Just knowing him.
The next day, it's a live event, or 2 days later, against Dr. Death Steve Williams. You mentioned he was starting around the same time you did. I'm curious, when you've got 2 guys who were sort of new to this, it's not like you have a veteran who can quote unquote call it in the ring. Are you guys able to discuss anything in these days, or is it still communicated through the referees? And, we as wrestling fans have heard that the person who is sort of the senior person or the quote unquote heel, they would call the match. How does that work with 2 young guys like you and Dr. Death at the time?
I'll tell you how it went that day. Here was the entire conversation. Me to Doc, please don't kill me. That was the end of the conversation. You're supposed to pop on that, Conrad.
I can only imagine.
That was a joke. Not a word was said. Doc came in, he just started rolling, and I just went with it. I had an idea from the referee when he came over and said, hey, this is Bill's project, want to get him over strong. And that's all that you said in those days. I knew not to try to take anything unless he created an opening for me. And in those days, that was the learning to work. If a guy grabbed your arm and he stayed there, he didn't advance his position, he meant for you to reverse it or try to reverse it or try to wrestle your way out of it. And if you reversed it and he reversed it back and there was a pause, he's looking for you to do something. It is up to you to have some knowledge in your wheelhouse of something to do in this particular situation. If a guy took a hammerlock and he's staying behind you and not trying to advance his position, then he probably wants you to reverse it. And that's kind of the unspoken language of wrestling. Grab something, the other guy will try to, reverse it. And if the guy blocks you, he's probably not ready for you to reverse it. It's probably that simple.
The next day, we're going to be hitting the road again. I know we've touched on it a little bit before, but I don't think we can properly convey to our listeners just how brutal the travel schedule had to be. Because as we were mentioning, 2 days in between matches, here and there, these are not short hauls. You're going from Baton Rouge, Louisiana to Houston, Texas to Shreveport, Louisiana to Jackson, Mississippi, back to Houston. This has to be wearing you down.
Well, it absolutely does. And, the thing that actually helped me was I didn't have a wife or a family at home.
Right.
I was free to, as long as I could get up in time to get a workout in, then the rest of my day was dedicated to getting to work, going to work, doing what I could while I was at work to get a little bit better every day. So I was in that ideal situation of just traveling, training, and wrestling. And the problem was the mileage, it didn't lend itself to doing a lot of partying, to be honest with you, because those roads in Louisiana, for the people that live there, God bless you. For the people that travel through there, you know what I'm talking about. They're very dark at night. There's deer jumping out in front of you. Other animals, raccoons, you name it, are always in the road. Armadillos, for God's sakes. But the roads are not lined. These are not highways. These are 2-lane roads. And if you drive from Baton Rouge to Shreveport, you got about 250 miles of 2-lane road.
Right.
And for those that don't travel a lot, that's a big difference than taking off from Charlotte and going down Interstate 85, which is 4 lanes for part of it, to Atlanta. These are 2-lane roads, and they're in bad shape, and there's police everywhere. And it's probably a good idea because they save a lot of lives by slowing a lot of people down. You can get used to a certain highway, and it was, we would travel some of these roads and you would kind of get a feel, okay, I'm coming up to Bunkie. Bunkie's the next little town. And you knew there was a bad curve coming into Bunkie, so you would slow it down. But the first time you go through there, it's an eye opener. It really is. It's and those potholes in the roads haven't been paved in God knows, decades. You're always blowing a tire out. When you'd be 30, 40 miles from a gas station. There were no cell phones. If one of the guys that were traveling the same route didn't come behind you, see you on the side of the road. And in those days, it was like a cardinal rule. If there was a car on the side of the road, you pulled right up beside it and identified who was in it before you went on. That was the way we took care of it. And it was an unwritten rule in those days. But for Louisiana, it was imperative.
Let's talk about what's next for you. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Mike Sharp, who we've talked about before, gets a win over you here. 3 days later, you're working for Paul Bosch, Houston Wrestling. Dr. Death is the opponent here. And again, he's on the A side. We've talked a little bit about Paul Bosch, but what was just a typical day like?
There was no difference from our side. Because you would basically get there for a house show, an hour was required before the show started. Paul Bosch was like the co-promoter. Him and, Bill, I guess, owned Texas together, as far, not Texas, but Houston. I never spoke to the man, to be honest with you, because I was way down the order. But the one thing that universally I've always heard about Paul Bosch was he was a good man and he was a good payoff guy, and he treated the talent fairly. And that's what was the case with me. But basically it would just be when you had a trip like that, which was 275 going across from Baton Rouge, notoriously we would have something booked the next day, like Biloxi, which is 100 from Baton Rouge. So you had to go round trip. So that's 550, back and forth to Houston.
Sure.
But I heard, Bruce will tell you a lot of great stories. I guess Paul Bosch was a surrogate father to Bruce. And, but I just heard he was just a good, honest payoff guy. That was always the story about Paul Bosch.
Let's keep it moving here and talk about Kelly Kaniski. Another name we haven't spent a lot of time talking about. You're working with him on January 18th at the Riverside Centralplex back in Baton Rouge. Man, another great legend that we've talked about before, but this isn't your first match against him. Are you starting to get a rhythm with some of these guys when you have multiple matches? As a young performer, do you try something different every time, or do you start to develop, hey, he does this well and I do that well, let's do it again, but see if we can get better at the same sequence, if that makes sense?
Yeah. you're 100% correct, and you're right on as far as that. You may only lose, with Kelly, who would come in and Kelly would want to work with you, and Kelly was trying to get better and he had a good attitude and all those things. You may learn just a wrestling sequence with Kelly that night because he was more, he was more advanced than you were, had been around longer than you had. Let's just say you're with Steve Williams that night. And the only thing maybe you learned was, take your bumps. And we're learning not only how to work and wrestle, but take bumps and all that stuff. Maybe I learned tonight how to take a backdrop the right way, working with Doc. Yeah. That's the one thing that I got a little bit better with. Kelly was one of those guys, that was trying to find his way. And again, his dad was a famous wrestler. It was hard to overcome, that stigma, which I kind of got the sense of that, with Kelly just a little bit. And don't ask me why. It just felt like, he was trying to impress his dad, which why wouldn't he? Most second generation wrestlers want to please their fathers. So.
Next up after the Kelly Kaniski match is a team with you and Kelly Kaniski, and you're going to take on Buddy Landell and Tony Torres. And I can't believe this is real. I had to do a double take. You won a match on TV. Now, granted, Kelly probably hit his finish, but still, you're on the A side. You win something, and you're wrestling a name that a lot of us are familiar with, Buddy Landell. But before we talk about him, Tony Torres, any memories of him?
I don't remember Tony Torres. You got any info on his bio?
I got nothing, but we all know about the other nature boy, Buddy Landell from Knoxville, Tennessee. I think a lot of people saw Buddy's work early in his career and thought, man, this is going to be a top guy. And then through a series of different decisions and events, that didn't happen. What do you remember about wrestling Buddy here for Mid-South?
Well, Buddy, you got a sense that Buddy definitely believed his own shit. And that's a good thing. But I started to be around Buddy a little bit. And I started to see him at some of the shows because, as you can tell, one day you may walk in and be working on the babyface side, like Kelly floated back and forth a little bit. One day you may be on the heel side. But in that particular match, I could probably guarantee you if we won, Kelly went over Tony Torres. So I know I never won a match the whole time I was with Watts, which is fine. If I was on the winning team, that was some feather in your hat. But here's your Buddy Landell story. Being from Tennessee originally, Tim Horner knew him a little bit. I think they might have bumped into each other before they got to Watts. And I was living with Tim. So Tim Horner is one of those guys that's a really, really good friend. If he's your friend, he's a great dude. Tim Horner got guts for days. And if you offend him, he's a redheaded son of a bitch. He'll fight you. So him and I are over the apartment one day, and we're going to be hooking up with rides. And I think Buddy was coming over and hook up with somebody else. And whatever the ride situation was, I was in my bedroom. Tim was in his bedroom. And I think we might have been packing our bags right before getting ready to leave. And we hear Buddy just coming in the door. Didn't lock, didn't knock, didn't ring the doorbell. He's screaming, "Hey, where's everybody at? Hey, where's everybody at?" So I said something, "Hey, I'm packing my bag." Tim said something, "Hey, I'll be with you in a minute," or something, Buddy. And Buddy, in about 10 seconds, said, "Hey, let's blow this puke hole." Now he's referring to our home. I immediately was offended. Tim immediately was really offended. And we came screaming out of each one of those bedroom doors and did a double knockout. To us, he was insulting our home. Yes, yeah. It was a very small, moderately prepared not prepared. What's the word I'm looking for?
Appointed.
Furnished.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a very, very sparsely furnished place. It's not meant to be a show place. We're just passing through. But we kind of got up in Buddy's grill. Buddy figured out he had shit the bed, and we had a quiet little word with Buddy about that. So that was just the way he was. Buddy spoke without thinking a lot of times. But the one thing I knew, and that everybody knew, in those days, Buddy was, prior to being injured, had a really good body. He had dark hair at that time, but he had that enviable hair, especially for a jabroni like me who had nothing going on in the hairdo department. But he was a really handsome guy. He was already a good worker, and you just knew, or I knew, he was destined for big things in the business. He was a star already, and he was working first match.
Wow. Same day, it's a TV taping. Art Cruz and Tim Horner are going to get a win over Marty Lunde and Tom Renesto Jr. A couple of the names I'm not super familiar with. Tom Renesto Jr., I believe, is from Memphis. Anything you can tell us about Tom Renesto?
You know who his dad was? He was one of the assassins.
Okay.
One of the original assassins with Jody Hamilton.
That's awesome.
That's a trivia. I can't believe you didn't know that.
I didn't know that. What about Art Cruz? Anything you can tell us about him?
Just a really nice man. Art was, one of those guys that was pretty average in his look, pretty decent worker at that time. Now, Tom Renesto Jr. was a damn good worker. He wasn't under the, he wasn't doing the assassin thing or anything. He was just Tom Renesto Jr. But, they made a pretty good team to where we could go out and actually have a pretty decent little match.
Why don't you think Renesto Jr. is a name many of us are familiar with?
If he walked in the room, he could have very well been a sixth grade school teacher. He could have been the Orkin man showing up at your door. He could have been bringing a pizza. Nothing about his look or demeanor or anything else screamed wrestler. He's just very normal.
The only time I remember even seeing him was on an old trading card from Pabst Blue Ribbon and Rack's Roast Beef. It's one of the more coveted wrestling trading cards. And he has, Google him, Tom Renesto Jr. You'll see what we're talking about. Next up, as we mentioned, that was a TV taping. But now you're going to be working with Tim Horner on the 22nd, and that one's in Jackson, Mississippi at the National Guard Armory. On the 25th, Chavo Guerrero is going to get a win over you in Baton Rouge. On the 28th, Dick Murdoch is going to beat you in Houston for Houston Wrestling. Are you enjoying the relationship that Bosch has with Watts? I mean, do you view this as a valuable learning experience, or is it really all that different from working for Watts?
No, and we were working for Watts. The only thing that we knew was that Mr. Bosch was co-owner, but he didn't do any of the hands-on stuff. Now, if he dealt with like Tully and Gino when they would come in, that would be something different because they weren't working Watts territory. But when Watts crew showed up, we were working under his rules. Grizzly Smith was the boss. He ran the show. All the rules were Bill Watts rules. Just the one thing that after being there a couple of times that you could count on, if you were an underneath guy, now I figured up, I averaged about $500 a week there, which is not a lot of money.
Yeah.
When you're starting to pump out that gas and pay for car repairs and living expenses and all that. Thank God it was just me that I was looking after. But you could count on like a $250 to anywhere between there and $300 payoff in the first match. That made your week. No matter what else you made that week, you still had a pretty good jump on a decent week. And it meant you'd have a few bucks extra you could tuck away.
February 1st, as we're finished with January of 83, you're in a losing effort to Mike Sharp in Baton Rouge. The next day, the Junkyard Dog beat you on TV. And of course, as was the case a lot of times, it was double duty. You also had Mr. Wrestling 2 team up with Junkyard Dog to beat you and your partner, Don Bass, not Ron Bass, but Don Bass from West Memphis, Arkansas. He wrestled as the Punisher and the Scorpion and the Rock and Roll Phantom and Assassin Number 2 and the Boston Strangler, but not a name a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with. But Lord, he wrestled a long time. What can you tell us about Don Bass?
I don't even remember, but I know Ron and Don Bass were a name on the smaller circuit. You know, I say smaller circuit, Tennessee. I'm sure they worked for Continental. I'm sure they worked, plenty of territories with all those gimmick names he had to have. And I'm sure that particular day he's looking around going, who is this jabroni partner that I have? For sure.
Well, you refer to yourself as a jabroni, and now since you said that, it feels like as good a time of any. You're cutting your teeth. You're on the losing effort of a lot of these matches. You're making towns. You're eking out a living. You're honing your craft. And as you said, a lot of times you guys would sort of heal a room. So you're doing whatever you can to make towns, and you're paying for car repairs and just beating the shit out of your car. And then somewhere in this run with Bill Watts, something unexpected happens, and you start riding in style. Tell us a little bit about how that came to be.
Well, let me cover something for Pee Wee, and I don't know if we talked about this on a previous episode, but somewhere during all this, Dog, I don't know if he sent Pee Wee out to run an errand during a show or something, go to a convenience store, or I don't remember the exact story, but JYD hired Pee Wee as his assistant, basically to drive him to the towns and drive him back. Then Pee Wee went from that job description till they broke him in as a referee. So now he had a full-time job, which was a pretty cool thing because he was able then to help out with the bills a little bit, which he hadn't done in the past. So I thought I would cover that, which was pretty important because when I left, which is coming up in our story, Pee Wee stayed, and he stayed for years. He met his wife up there, made a home for him. That turned into a long-term gig for him. So thought I'd throw that in. So now getting back to the question, the mystery guy that I was riding with suddenly. So, which I didn't know, but apparently each week that passed, I was getting an inch better and an inch better. And the top heel for Bill Watts in Mid-South at that particular time was Ted DiBiase, who was a huge star. And he was teamed with Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Matt Bourne, and they were wrestling as the Rat Pack, and they pretty much encompassed the top heels in the company, and they were red hot. Matt Bourne was an excellent worker. Teddy was an incredible worker, could talk. Hacksaw Jim Duggan was a steamroller, which Bill Watts loved. You know, I mean, he was one of those guys that would go in a bar and clean it out if anybody gave him any crap. But Teddy was the businessman. He was the guy. He was the guy going out every night making JYD look like $1 trillion. So one night I came back through the curtain and he pulled me aside and he said, hey, I watched your match. I just want to give you a couple tips if you're receptive. I just sat there, my jaw on the ground. What do you say to that? I said, well, of course, please. And he told me 2 or 3 things that he liked and 2 or 3 things he didn't like. And he said, this is an easy fix. Just move this over here, move that over there. And, I've been kind of watching you for a little bit. And he says, you're getting better every week. I don't know if you know that or not. I said, well, I'd hoped I was. I'm sure trying to get better. That's my goal. He says, well, I tell you what, you live in Baton Rouge, right? You live with Tim Horner. That's not very far from my house. Why don't you start riding with me?
Wow.
That didn't happen in those days, Conrad.
No.
You didn't have an underneath guy. Now, Teddy's got a Trans Am. Now, we're talking Burt Reynolds, black Trans Am. Sharp as a tack. So now I went from riding in my Buick Regal, which was getting beat up more by the day, to meeting Teddy, riding to the towns up and back, and driving his Trans Am. And the learning experience that I got from just listening, especially on the trips back when it was fresh in your head and you had just made a few mistakes and he's clearing them up, you still remember them. That kind of, that's what we did in those days. When you learn more on the trips almost sometimes with guys critiquing each other and helping each other than you did in the ring.
Yeah.
And, man, I learned so much from him, and he was so unselfish with his comments and his advice, and plus didn't charge me a dime, which immediately was putting X amount of dollars right back in my pocket, which made it easier. When you're living week to week, that extra not having to pay $20 for that trip or $25 for that trip in gas or trans, it helped. It really did. And he was very, very generous. And he was my very first mentor to that degree, which you didn't hear many of those stories that day, because here was the thought process. Why would I get this? Why would I help this guy get real good just to take my job? And that was the mentality. It was the unspoken mentality.
Tell me about some of the things that he would have taught you, that you would have learned from Ted DiBiase making those car trips.
Make your punches credible, believable, make them pay off. When you're working a hold, make sure there's no air, what we call air in the hold. It's not loose. You can't see. It's nice and tight. It looks like a legitimate hold, and another inch or two, and it will be a legitimate hold. And basically just going out and making sure that when you're working with baby faces, that you make them superior to you. You never outpunch, out wrestle, or make a baby face look bad. You never punk them out. You can beat them up, but you don't punk them out, because once a baby face doesn't react to something that's been done to him, you slap a baby face in the face, he better knock you on your ass. If you don't, match is over. He's done, because he got punked out.
Right.
Those innuendos, those bridges between the bumps are the things that Teddy already had down. And man, when he would feed a comeback to Junkyard Dog, it was as loud as anything I had ever heard or seen since. And Dog was God in Louisiana and out through there, Oklahoma.
And you're going to be working with Dog your next match after Mike Sharp, February 2nd. On TV, Dog beats you, and then that same night, as I think I mentioned, Mr. Wrestling 2 and the Junkyard Dog beat you and Don Bass. So double duty here, but JYD is just all over the place. But we're talking about DiBiase, and one of the things that intrigued a lot of fans when you and I first announced that we were doing a show is the idea that they knew that you were considered to be, in most people's opinion, one of the best promos in wrestling. At this point in your wrestling career, have you even done a promo?
No, absolutely not. There was no spot. I was strictly a first or second match, third at the most, tackling dummy that was just trying to learn the mechanics of having a match, the psychology of having a match that made sense, and just working on that. You would have never got a promo in those days. That time was so valuable and so critical. Remember, it was a 1-hour show, and you were trying to expose all these top talents and talents that were upper middle, so that when a top guy beat an upper middle guy, it meant something. And when a upper middle guy pulled one out of his keister and he beat a top guy, then you had a star, and he was made. There was no spot for doing promos. Now, before I got in the business, and my friends in Rome, Georgia, Tony Zane, myself, Kenny Green, Pee Wee, when we would be riding around town drinking and rednecking and all that stuff, hell, we were cutting promos on each other back then.
Right.
because we're all wrestling fans, and people may think that's goofy, but I still use some of that stuff, over the years. And it was just being a smart ass and being a heel. And I always had that mentality of being a wise ass. And, but at that point, I didn't have any promo time or the possibility of even doing a promo for Watts.
Are you talking to DiBiase or listening to DiBiase, sort of getting his insight onto what makes a good promo, or is it strictly in-ring stuff?
Yeah, we didn't talk about promos too much because that was so advanced for where I was. You got to remember, I'm, however many months for Watts at this point, plus 3 weeks in Pensacola prior to that. That's not a lot of experience in those days. So we didn't talk about that as much. It was more about matches and coming up with offense that, that's different. And the main thing was make it solid, make it credible, and be different. He gave me nothing but good advice.
Talk to me a little bit about his advice about working with Watts. In those days, there were no such things as long-term contracts. You operate on a handshake, and you honor your word, and you do the honors on your way out of a territory, et cetera, et cetera. And we know DiBiase is going to go on to be a much bigger star with Vince McMahon as the $1 Million Man, and his legacy is going to be all set. But are you asking, as a young guy just trying to eke out a living, hey man, what's the next step for me? What should I do to advance my career financially? And does it involve sort of knowing when to move on? I think I've heard Michael Hayes say before, you leave when you're on top, so you've always got a place to come back to. Are you having those type conversations with Ted?
No. You got to remember what Michael is talking about is once you're a top guy and you're a commodity, all the rules change.
Right.
You call your spots. You book yourself in the next territory. You call ahead and go, hey, things are starting to, get a little muddled here, creatives are shits. Baby faces are hurt. I got nobody to work with. Whatever the issue would be that you feel like it's time to go, you kind of handle that yourself. I was clinging to just making sure that when that booking sheet came out every week, my name was on it. Right. I wasn't looking to do anything further. I never had a money situation. Hey, how do I make more money? Because I was smart enough to know my goal was not to be the world champion. My goal was not to main event Madison Square Garden. My goal was to be a good wrestler. I wanted to be Dick Slater. I wanted to be a guy that every time he stepped through the ropes, he created excitement. And that I wanted to be a guy that could have a match with anybody, big or small, and it be credible and make sense and tell a good story. We never talked about money, and I knew just from hearing him, conversations, sometimes money would come up and he would be talking to Duggan or Bourne, and, they would go, a hell of a week last week, hell of a payoff on that town. It jumped, that angle worked, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But I never asked anybody. And you know what? My entire career, Conrad, I've never asked what anybody made. It's none of my business. The only thing I was ever concerned with is, am I making enough to take care of my family, pay my taxes, save some money, and advance my life for when this is no longer a part of my life? It just never came up.
This is a weird question to ask, but do you have any time for social at all while you're working for Watts? Like, these days, of course, the guys who are hanging out after the matches who want to meet the wrestlers, well, they look like me and Stan. But back then, I assume there were some ladies who thought, man, look at that TV star, and he's young and an athlete and in good shape, and he's famous. I need to hang out with that guy. Did that exist in the Watts territory? We never hear about that in the Watts territory.
Well, here was my extent of it. Jim Duggan asked me to go to a bar that was over on the side of town and not too far from where Tim and I lived, which was, again, the cops were out, buddy, in Louisiana. It was called Jim Beam's, and it was a cowboy joint. And Duggan asked me just out of the blue one night, hey, it's Tuesday night. I can't believe it, but I don't have interviews first thing in the morning. It was like his first time being off interviews or something. And I didn't have to, because the guys that had interviews the next day in Shreveport had to leave right after the show and drive on to Shreveport. Either that or you had to get up and leave at 4 a.m. So you just left after the show. So it didn't leave a lot of time for partying. But he said, hey, I don't have to be there until TV tomorrow night. So, hey, you want to go down to Jim Beam's? And I got introduced to Jim Duggan, Jack Daniels, an ice cube or two, fill up the glass, and that was it. I was a beer drinker. And about an hour, he had me cockeyed. So I got to talk to Jim and found out, a little bit about his career and him playing football, pro ball, and just really a super guy, man's man. One of those guys that, when he told you something, you could believe it. But in those days, I wasn't worried about partying. I was just worried about getting that car heading to the next town and or heading back home. And it was business all the way, because you can't just, punch in a bunch of hard drinking when you're trying to really learn something.
Yeah.
It gets in your way, and it really does. And for those 5 or 6 months, I was just trying to learn how to wrestle and be presentable and, get a foundation which would, help carry me forward for the rest of my career. That was my precedent. Even though I was a young guy and single, it wasn't high on the priority list.
Let's talk about what's next for you. February 11th, you're going to be losing to Mike Sharp at the Sam Houston Coliseum. 5 days later, you're back doing TV at the Irish McNeil Boys Club in Shreveport. You're going to do a draw here. You and Kelly Kaniski will team up against Art Cruz and Tim Horner. Of course, as with all TV, it's a double day. Mr. Wrestling 2 picks up a win in the very next episode. But about a week later, you find yourself back in Houston again, this time in a losing effort to Art Cruz. But the very next day, or I guess a week later, the very next week is what I want to talk about, because this is a name that we've talked about a little bit before, and I'm glad we get to talk about it again. You do TV at the Boys Club again in Shreveport on March 2nd, 1983, and you lose to Mr. Olympia, your old pal, Jerry Stubbs. What do you remember about working with him here for Watts?
You seen pictures of him from that era?
I have.
Did he look as good as anybody?
Yes.
Now, Jerry Stubbs could have been a mega star on a international level if he chose to venture out and go to the big territories. He could have went to WWE, which was WWF. He could have went to Crockett, anywhere he wanted to go, because that guy lived in Pensacola. He had a really nice home with a really nice pool area, and he was a guy that figured out pretty quick, get in the gym, get tanned, that tan thing, which people make a joke of. But a person just looks better with a tan. And Jerry had a hell of a body. He was tanned. The lady that made his masks and made his gear was excellent. He looked as professional, and he looked like a superstar. And I mean, he could work too. He had no holes anywhere. The only thing that was not a superlative, I would just say, is he's a pretty good promo, not a superlative promo, but it didn't matter because he had everything else. and I got to wrestle him, and he was so smooth and it's so good already. It was just one of those things that when I was done, I went, hey, the better man won. Look at the guy. And he looked incredible. And that's what Bill Watts, that look and the fact that he could work, it didn't matter that the promos weren't off the charts. He was incredible. But Jerry made his mind up that he was going to go as far as maybe Memphis, in and out of Continental, which was his home. And he would go over to Watts and he would work for a few months at a time. And because he could, if he wanted to, if he had ever had a day off, he could always drive back home and see his family. It was close enough. Like, say, Bill Watts ran Biloxi. Biloxi's 130 miles from Pensacola.
Yeah.
You could always just say, hey, I'm homesick. I'm going to run home for the day. And whatever the case may be, he may have to go to Pensacola and then drive back to Jackson or something like that. But and we'll get to our partnership and all that stuff later. But man, coming through that curtain, superstar.
It's a TV day, so you're working 2 matches. The next match that day on March 2nd is Tim Horner. You guys go to a draw. 10 days later, Art Cruz is going to beat you in Tulsa for Bill Watts. 4 days later, Kamala is going to beat you on TV again at the Boys Club in Shreveport. And then I want to mention 5 days later, there is a Mid-South North American title tournament. So now we're going to crown a new North American champion, that big monster of a belt. You're working with your old pal, Mr. Olympia again, Mr. Jerry Stubbs. He beat you. A couple of days later, Art Cruz would beat you in Little Rock, Arkansas. That's got to be a hike. And then I think you're going to finish up all your Watts duties in a losing effort to Butch Reed at the Sam Houston Coliseum in Houston, Texas. Pretty good match too, 9 minutes and 45 seconds. Before we talk about everything going on behind the scenes, tell us about working Butch here in Sam Houston.
9 minutes with Butch?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, backing up just a little bit, believe this or not, you mentioned there was a couple scattered time limit draws on TV.
Yeah.
That meant, believe it or not, I was advancing, and the office was noticing, because I went from getting beat to a draw. That's a step up.
Yes, it is.
It really is. People are going to laugh at that and go, "Oh, come on, man, like kissing your sister." No, it wasn't. And if you knew the business, if you went from just doing jobs every week to a draw, it meant they saw that and that was their way to reward you. They didn't beat you that week. So if I went 9 minutes with Butch Reed, he must have been in a very good mood that night, because his positioning, and he looked like $1 million too, and was a hell of a worker. Butch would have been positioned way, way up the card for me. That must have just been one night to get him a win, and he decided that he might have saw something and took advantage of it and let us have a little bit of a competitive match.
Well, let's talk about behind the scenes, because I think somewhere in here is where things start to change for you in a big way. Let's first address, we're going to have a meeting of the minds, if you will, where you're going to have a major, I don't want to say gimmick change, but this entire time we've been talking so far, from the very beginning of your career until late March of 1983, you've been Marty Lunde. But something happens in the locker room that changes all that, not only your name, but your location. Catch us up on how that story came to be.
It was really unbelievable, to be honest with you. We always talk about, boy, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall and heard that conversation. You've heard that cliche.
Of course.
I actually got to be a fly on the wall. Now, Bill Watts, was a very intimidating guy. He was professional every minute of every day. He didn't really spend a lot of time talking to the underneath guys. I don't think I'd ever had a conversation with him at all. This whole time I was there, but I was sitting in the locker room, and JYD was across the way there, and Bill came in, and he's talking to Matt Bourne and Duggan and DiBiase, and he goes, okay, guys, we're going to, you guys have had a hell of a run. I'm going to send Bourne to Atlanta. Oldie wants him. He's going to put him with Paul Ellering as a manager. We're just going to get you a partner, Matt. And he said, Bill, whatever you want, da 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 da. And Matt had made a ton of money for Watts, so he was going along with anything. And just out of nowhere, you hear this deep voice. Hey, Bill, that Lunde looks just like Ole Anderson. Won't you send him with Bourne, make him an Anderson? Bill looks at me. He looks at him. He went, JY, you are 100% right. And he looked at me and he said, how's that sound to you? And I'm swallowing my teeth. I went, fantastic. Sounds great. So he says, I'll be back with you. So he left. In about 30 minutes, I guess he called back. He says, Lunde, good idea, JY. Ole's all over it. He said, you start in 10 days as Matt's partner. Paul Ellering will be your manager. You start in Georgia Championship Wrestling 10 days. You'll finish up next week at TV or tomorrow at TV, I think you said. You'll finish up. That'll give you time to get moved and all that stuff. I couldn't believe it. Right there, that quick, say timing is everything. I just happened to be sitting there. JYD made it happen with just a word. That's how much power top guys had in those days. And that's how you caught a break.
Lots to unpack here. To recap, you never had any sort of sit down conversation with Bill Watts the entire time working for him.
No.
Whenever you would get your payoff from him, he hands you just an envelope with your name on it or something?
He doesn't hand anybody anything. They would hand it out at, I think TV is when you would get paid, but it would be somebody, it was below Grizz, whoever handed out the paychecks.
And it's cash or a check?
It's a check.
Made your real name, which at the time was your working name, but is there a breakdown of what you got paid for each match, or were you just left to guess?
Each town and the payoff that was there. And, you would kind of have an idea if the town was good or whatever. And there was guys that would be bitching, hey, the house was up and all that stuff. And I was hearing conversations going on that were valid, but I just was glad to be there. I mean, it's so silly that I wasn't even worried about what that number was. If it was enough to get me through the next week expenses, it's all I cared about. Because I was getting to do what I'd wanted to do since I was 8 years old, Conrad. It was happening. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about losing. It wasn't about getting banged around by the veterans. It wasn't about driving myself to the point that I caught myself a couple times off in the median, in the weeds, and that's what woke me up. Could have very easily been killed a couple times in car wrecks. It was the fact that I was getting to go to these towns in front of these crowds and hear the audiences react to what I was doing, pro or con. I was living it. I mean, living the dream has become so cliche, and it's almost one of those things that it leaves a bad taste in your mouth because most people don't mean it when they say it, but I meant it because it was happening.
So I don't want to be super granular on the cash, but did you get paid the same amount for every town, or was it really based on the house, like you were saying?
You could make as little as $40-50 for a town like LaRanger, which was just down the road from Baton Rouge. Tulsa and Oak City, which was the big one, they would book that about once a month, once every 6 weeks, double shot that day, 300 per shot. Your week was made 600. The bad news is it was 700 miles to drive back after doing that double shot to Baton Rouge overnight.
I know this sounds silly because we're getting so granular, but I do want to ask it's worth mentioning. You find out all in one felt swoop. Hey, you're no longer going to be losing matches. Now you're going to be winning matches. Oh, you got a tag team partner. Oh, and you got a new name. Oh, and you don't work here anymore. Oh, and last but certainly not least, you got to move. So let's talk about the move thing first. You've been bunking up with your pal Tim Horner. Is he cool and understanding that you got an opportunity, you got to move on? Or is he sort of pissed off like, no, hey, wait a minute. We've been splitting the bills. What gives?
Well, you know what happened? Again, timing's everything. I told you Pee Wee had a job with JYD, starting to referee. Now he moved from the couch, which he was staying for free. He took my bedroom. Now he's paying half the rent.
I got you. No problem for Tim.
And if it hadn't been Pee Wee, the next underneath guy that came in, if Tim would have saw that he could be able to live with the guy, that guy would have got the spot. But the payoffs in those days, it really was dependent on how good the house was,
right?
How much the expenses were, because it did vary. You could go down the road to New Orleans, which was 85 miles from Baton Rouge. And, because the rent at that building downtown was not real bad, you could make a nice payoff down there. You could pick up underneath, you could pick $200 up. But you had $40, you had $50 towns. You go down to Houma, which was a very small building. That could be a $75 payoff. But I figured it up, and I averaged the time I was there for the 5 months about $500 a week.
Hey, Big Daddy, you got to get excited about saving people money. Woo! Woo!
SaveWithConrad.com. So the other thing that we sort of glossed over, you look like Ole Anderson, so we're going to make you an Anderson. Do you know that your name is Arn Anderson yet, or just that you're going to be an Anderson?
I didn't know exactly what was going to happen. I knew that was the plan. So we had a meeting for the first TV. Said Ole had sent word to me, and he said, "You be at TV early. We'll talk." And when I walked in, he looked at me and he went, "Son of a bitch, you do look like me." I don't know what to say to that. What do you say to that? So I just didn't say nothing. And he cocked back in his chair and he went, "Okay, they were right. Your name now is Arn Anderson." And it just happened just like that.
And that's where we'll pick it up next week when we talk about all things Georgia Championship Wrestling. As you heard Arn allude to, he's got a new tag team partner, Matt Bourne, who most of you probably remember as Doink, but boy, he was a hell of a performer before he was a clown for Vince McMahon. We're going to talk about that. And how about this for a first match in the territory? Arn's going to team with Matt to take on Brian Blair and Tito Santana. It's a Hall of Fame affair, and Arn's smarting everybody up. You've got a great new duo here. It's you and Matt Bourne, and of course, Paul Ellering is your manager, and your team name was?
Destruction Incorporated.
Come on, man. This is going to be fun talking about all things Georgia Championship Wrestling. We're going to pick it up where we left off here in 2 weeks. Next week, we're going to take a timeout and do another Ask Arn Anything. Now, we've had a lot of fun with Ask Arn Anything because you've really gotten to know the man behind the character, but now we're going to do sort of a territory-specific effort. So we want your questions about working for Bill Watts, about the drives, about the states, about the towns, and about the performers, whether it was working for Grizzly or tagging with some great tag team partners along the way, working with Bruno Jr., who could forget Mr. Wrestling too? What about JYD? Maybe you've got a question about DiBiase. Everything we've covered so far, including the trip to Pensacola with Pee Wee and Bullet Bob, we want to really double down on those questions, and that's what we're bringing to you next week. And then we'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about Georgia Championship Wrestling. It really is a who's who, and a lot of names we haven't talked about in a long time. Guys like Brian Blair, guys like Paul Orndorff, guys like Tommy Rich, of course, Tito Santana, as we mentioned earlier, Paul Ellering, Pat Rose, Mr. Wrestling 2. It is quite the affair for Georgia Championship Wrestling, and we're just getting started as we've sort of hit the reset button for all things Arn. tell your friends, take another look. Maybe they didn't want to hear about, and Arn certainly didn't want to talk about being an agent anymore. So we're going to the good old days, and it doesn't get any better than Georgia Championship Wrestling. So that's coming your way in 2 weeks. But next week it's Ask Arn Anything. And if you've got a question, you can ask on Twitter right now at the Arn Show. Arn, this has been fun, man. What say you?
I love it. Like I said, Conrad, just like it's fascinates me how you got where you are. That trip and that story is as fascinating as walking through your home and seeing your beautiful outside pool area and all that. It's how did he get there? And that's what I like talking about. That's what I think a lot of people like hearing about. So, man, this is fun for me. I'm reliving my life, all of it.
And we should mention we've got some fun excursions, if you will, along the way. Between each territory, we're going to check back in and do a Q&A so we can answer those territory-specific questions. You can ask them again at the Orange Show on Twitter. But we're also going to occasionally mix in a guest or two here or there. We've already got a couple in mind. And Arn, as you and I are recording this, we're about a week late, but I do feel like we should at least mention and acknowledge that you lost somebody that you shared a lot of time with recently. Mr. Canoodle passed away last week, I guess it was. And I couldn't believe the news, and we shared a text message conversation back and forth. What can you tell us about Mr. Canoodle and maybe some of our younger listeners who aren't familiar with his work? If you can recommend anything, they should go check out of his.
Yeah, I mean, he was a fantastic partner with Sergeant Slaughter. They had great chemistry. When I first got to Jim Crockett Promotions, he was just finishing up. He was a good, solid hand. He had an infectious laugh. Anybody that knows Don Canoodle, first thing they'll say is he had this loud, boisterous laugh, and it was, it would just shake the walls. But I mean, he was one of those guys that was just a good, solid human being. After his wrestling career was over, he had another career in law enforcement, and he's just one of those guys that you really could bank on whatever he said to you. And, our thoughts and prayers go out to his brother and his family and all the friends that he had. It's a terrible loss, that's for sure.
Yeah, best wishes to his family. I feel weird even saying that. It's almost become a cliche, but I got to know him a little bit through the NWA Legends Fan Fest in Charlotte that I saw you at a few of those over the years, and just a great guy. And he never always had a kind word for everybody, had a funny story about everything, and he will be missed. And you just hate to hear, any sort of sad news like that. So if you're digging some of the territory stuff we're doing, go dig up some Canoodle matches on YouTube and check that out, especially the stuff with Slaughter. I'm with you. That's probably some of the more high profile stuff, but what a life he had. And I hope that, some of our younger listeners go check him out and reinvest some time in the guys who helped pave the way. Arn, how about that?
I would say this, he and Slaughter against Steamboat and Youngblood in Greensboro is one of the biggest wrestling matches there's ever been. There were cars lined up for 20 miles back down 85 South trying to get to that arena. It was an event, big time.
And we hope that next week is an event when we do Ask Arn Anything, and it's a very special territory edition. All things Watts, all things Pensacola. We'll be back next week right here on Arn.
Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell so you get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And go save yourself some money right now. If you're in a 30-year loan or you have credit card debt, it's not a matter of if I can save you money. It's a matter of how much. Find out right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com.